You shocked the system, not because you were the strongest, not because you had the most resources, not because everything went your way. You shocked the system because you did something most people never dare to do. You refused to follow the script that was quietly written for you. See, the system, it thrives on predictability. It expects you to react in certain ways. When life hits you, it expects you to break. When people doubt you, it expects you to shrink. When fear shows up, it expects you to run. That's how it maintains control, by keeping everyone moving in patterns so familiar that no one questions them. But you didn't react the way you were supposed to. When pressure came, you didn't collapse. You adapted. When negativity surrounded you, you didn't absorb it. You redirected it. When your own mind tried to trap you in cycles of doubt, you didn't surrender. You observed it, challenged it, and then rose above it. And that's what shocked everything. Because the moment you stop reacting like everyone else, you become unpredictable. And when you become unpredictable, you become powerful. People don't always notice consistency. They don't pay attention when someone is just doing what's expected. But the moment you break the pattern, the moment you step outside the box they placed you in, suddenly, all eyes are on you. Wait, how did they do that? They were struggling just like us. That doesn't make sense, exactly. It doesn't make sense to them, because they're still operating within the limits they've accepted. Limits you decided to question. You see, negative feelings are one of the system's strongest tools. Not because they're bad, but because most people don't know what to do with them. They let those feelings control their decisions. They let fear dictate their actions. They let doubt rewrite their identity. And slowly, without even realizing it, they become smaller versions of who they could have been. But you felt the same emotions. Don't get it twisted. You're not different because you never struggled. You're different because when those emotions came, you didn't treat them as commands. You treated them as signals. Fear didn't mean stop to you.
It meant pay attention.
Doubt didn't mean give up. It meant prepare better. Pain didn't mean hunt. It meant transform. That shift, that one mental shift, is enough to break everything the system relies on. Because now, instead of being controlled by your internal world, you're directing it. And once that happens, something interesting begins to unfold. You stop needing validation. You stop waiting for permission. You stop explaining yourself to people who were never meant to understand your journey in the first place. And that's when the real disruption begins. Because the system isn't just external, it's internal too. It's built from years of conditioning. Voices that told you who you are, what you can do, what you should fear, what you should avoid. It's a quiet program running in the background of your mind, shaping your decisions without you even noticing. Most people never question it. You did. You started catching your own thoughts. You started noticing patterns. You started asking yourself, is this really me? Or is this something I was taught to believe? And once you ask that question, you can't unsee the answer. That's when things start to break. Not you. The illusion. The illusion that you're limited. The illusion that your past defines you. The illusion that your emotions are in control. And when that illusion breaks, something else takes its place. Clarity. You begin to see that negative feelings aren't permanent states. They're temporary waves. They rise, they peak, and they fall. And instead of drowning in them, you start learning how to ride them. That's a different level of awareness, a level most people never reach because they're too busy trying to escape discomfort instead of understanding it. But you stayed. You sat with it. You listened. And in doing so, you turned what was supposed to weaken you into something that sharpened you. That's why the system is shaken. Because it doesn't know what to do with someone who can't be easily controlled. You're not reacting the way it predicted. You're not staying where it placed you. You're not becoming who it assumed you would be. And that creates disruption. Now people start questioning their own limits when they see you break yours. Now expectations start collapsing because you proved they weren't absolute. Now the narrative starts shifting because you refuse to follow it. And here's the truth. Most people won't say out loud. They're not just surprised, they're uncomfortable. Because your growth forces them to confront their own stagnation. Your courage highlights their hesitation. Your discipline exposes their excuses. And that's not easy for anyone to accept. But that's not your responsibility. Your responsibility is to keep going, to keep building that control over your mind, to keep transforming every negative feeling into something useful, to keep proving, not to them, but to yourself, that you are not defined by what you feel in your lowest moments. Because those moments, they're not the end of your story. They're the beginning of your evolution. Every time you face negativity and choose growth, you reinforce a new identity. An identity that isn't fragile. An identity that doesn't collapse under pressure. An identity that doesn't depend on perfect conditions to move forward. That's the identity that shocks the system. Not a perfect person. Not someone who never struggles. But someone who refuses to be controlled by their struggles. And once you reach that point, something changes permanently. You stop fearing bad days. You stop fearing failure. You stop fearing your own thoughts. Because you know, no matter what shows up, you have the ability to handle it, to process it, to learn from it, to use it. That's real power. Not the absence of negativity, but mastery over it. And that's why what you did is so rare. Because most people spend their lives trying to avoid discomfort. You walked straight into it and came out stronger. That's not normal. That's disruptive. That's history being made. Not in headlines, not on stages, but inside a mind that decided to break free. So if it feels like things are shifting, if it feels like people are looking at you differently, if it feels like you've stepped in something unfamiliar, good. That means it's working. That means the system you once lived inside no longer defines you. And that means one thing, you didn't just survive your negative feelings. You used them to become someone the system never saw coming. Pain was your teacher, not the kind you asked for, not the kind you chose, but the kind that showed up anyway, when invited, relentless, impossible to ignore. It didn't knock politely. It broke the door down, rearranged everything, and forced you to sit in a reality you never planned for. And at first, you resisted it. Of course you did. You tried to escape it, numb it, distract yourself from it. You told yourself it wasn't fair. You questioned why it had to be you. You replayed moments, conversations, decisions, wondering where it all went wrong. That's what most people do when pain arrives. They fight it, not realizing that the fight is what keeps them stuck. Because pain has a strange way of staying until it's understood. It doesn't leave just because you want it gone. It doesn't disappear just because you ignore it. It lingers, quietly shaping your thoughts, influencing your reactions, controlling your energy, until you finally turn around and face it. And that's the moment everything begins to change. You stopped running. Maybe not all at once. Maybe it was slow. Maybe it was messy. But at some point, you realized that escaping wasn't working. The distractions were temporary. The denial was exhausting. And the only way forward was through. So you sat with it. You allowed yourself to feel what you had been avoiding. The discomfort, the anger, the emptiness, the confusion. All of it. No filters. No pretending. And in that space, uncomfortable as it was, something unexpected started to happen. You began to learn. Not from books, not from advice, but from experience. Raw, direct, undeniable experience. Pain started showing you things you couldn't see before. It showed you who was real and who wasn't. It revealed the difference between support and convenience. It exposed the habits that were quietly holding you back. It forced you to confront parts of yourself you had ignored for too long. That's what makes pain such a powerful teacher. It doesn't sugarcoat anything. It doesn't protect your ego. It doesn't tell you what you want to hear. It shows you what you need to see, and that truth. It's not always comfortable. Sometimes it stings more than the pain itself. Because now, it's not just about what happened to you. It's about how you respond to it. It's about the choices you make moving forward. It's about the responsibility you take for your own growth. That's a heavy realization. But it's also where your power begins, because once you start learning from pain instead of resisting it, it loses its ability to control you. It doesn't disappear, but it transforms. What once felt like something that was breaking you becomes something that's building you. You begin to notice it in small ways. Your tolerance for discomfort increases. Your reactions become more controlled. Your perspective starts to shift. Situations that used to overwhelm you. Now you pause, you think, you respond instead of react. Words that used to hurt you deeply. Now you analyze them, understand them, and decide whether they even deserve your energy. That's growth, not loud, not dramatic, but powerful. And it all comes from lessons that only pain could teach. You see, comfort doesn't force change. Comfort keeps things as they are. It's easy to stay the same when everything feels good. It's easy to avoid difficult truths when nothing is pushing you to confront them. Pain doesn't give you that option. It forces movement. It forces reflection. It forces evolution. And that's why, as much as people try to avoid it, pain is often the turning point in someone's life. It's the moment where staying the same becomes more painful than changing. And you reached that moment. You decided that you weren't going to let what you went through define you in a negative way. You weren't going to let it turn you bitter, closed off, or defeated. Instead, you made a different decision. You chose to extract something from it. A lesson, a perspective, a strength, something valuable. That's not easy, because it requires honesty. It requires patience. It requires the willingness to look at your own actions, your own patterns, your own mindset, and admit where you can grow. But that's exactly what you did. You started asking better questions. Instead of "Why is this happening to me?" you asked, "What is this trying to teach me?" Instead of "Why do I feel this way?" you asked, "What is this feeling pointing to?" Instead of "How do I escape this?" you asked, "How do I rise from this?" And those questions changed everything. Because now you're not a victim of your circumstances, you're a student of them. Every experience becomes data. Every emotion becomes insight. Every setback becomes a setup for something greater. That doesn't mean it's easy. There are still days when it feels heavy. Days when the lessons feel too slow, too unclear, too demanding. Days when the old habits try to pull you back into familiar patterns. But even on those days, you're not the same person you used to be. Because now you're aware. You recognize the patterns. You catch the thoughts. You question the reactions. And that awareness, it changes everything. It creates space between what you feel and what you do. And in that space is your power. The power to choose differently. The power to respond with intention. The power to keep moving forward, even when it's uncomfortable. That's what pain gave you. Not just strength, but clarity. Not just endurance, but direction. Not just survival, but transformation. And here's the part most people don't realize, the lessons don't end. Pain doesn't just teach you once and leave. It shows up in different forms, at different stages of your life, each time offering a new level of understanding. But now you're ready. Because you don't fear it the same way anymore. You respect it. You understand that within it, there's something valuable. Something that can push you further, shape you deeper, refine you into someone stronger. That doesn't mean you welcome pain. It means you no longer let it control you. You no longer see it as the end. You see it as part of the process. And that shift, that's what separates those who stay stuck from those who evolve. So when you look back at everything you've been through, all the moments that felt like they were breaking you, all the times you thought you wouldn't make it, all the nights that felt endless, you start to see it differently. Not as a series of setbacks, but as a series of lessons. Each one shaping you, each one strengthening you, each one preparing you for something greater. Pain was never just there to hurt you. It was there to teach you. And the fact that you learned from it, that you grew from it, that you're still moving forward because of it, that's what makes you different. That's what makes you stronger. That's what makes you someone who doesn't just go through life, but evolves through it. They expected you to break, not loudly, not dramatically, Just quietly, gradually, the way most people do. A slow fade, a silent surrender, the kind where no one even notices the exact moment you gave up, because it looks so normal. That's what they were waiting for. Because they've seen it before. They've seen people start strong and then disappear. They've seen ambition turn into hesitation. They've seen confidence slowly dissolve under pressure, until all that's left is someone who settles for less and calls it reality. So when things got hard for you, when the pressure started building, when the setbacks stacked up, when the weight of everything began to feel heavier than it should, they didn't panic. They assumed. Give it time. They'll slow down. They'll come back to normal. Because in their world, that's how the story usually ends. But your story didn't follow that pattern. And that's where the confusion began. At first, it looked like you were breaking. You had moments where the doubt crept in. Moments where your energy dropped. Moments where the negative thoughts got louder than they should have. You questioned yourself. You wondered if maybe they were right. Maybe this was too much. Maybe you weren't ready. Maybe you should just step back and accept something easier. That's the part no one talks about. The internal battles. Because from the outside, people only see results. They don't see the nights where your mind wouldn't quiet down. They don't see the conversations you had with yourself, trying to hold everything together. They don't see the effort it takes just to show up when everything inside you is telling you to stop. But you felt it. You lived it. And for a moment, it really did feel like you might break. That's what made it real. That's what made it dangerous. Because breaking doesn't always come from weakness. Sometimes it comes from exhaustion, from carrying too much for too long without a clear sign that it's worth it. From pushing forward without immediate results, without recognition, without reassurance. That's where most people stop, not because they can't continue, but because they convince themselves there's no point, and that's exactly what was expected of you. To reach that point and turn back, to feel that pressure and let it define your limit, to hear those doubts and accept them as truth. But something in you refused, not loudly, not in a way that needed attention. Just a quiet decision, almost invisible to anyone else, that said, not this time. That decision changed everything. Because you didn't eliminate the pressure. You endured it. You didn't silence the doubts completely. You learned how to move despite them. You didn't wait for things to feel easy. You kept going while they were still hard. And that's what they didn't expect. They expected you to need perfect conditions. They expected you to rely on motivation. They expected you to fold when things stopped making sense. But instead, you built something deeper. You built discipline. The kind that doesn't depend on how you feel. The kind that shows up even when you're tired. The kind that keeps moving forward, step by step, even when the outcome isn't clear. That's not common. That's not predictable. And that's why it stands out. Because now, the same situations that were supposed to break you are revealing your strength. The same challenges that were meant to slow you down are becoming proof of your resilience. The same doubts that once echoed in your mind are losing their power, one decision at a time. And people are noticing, not always openly, not always with support, but they see it. They see that you didn't stop. They see that you didn't fall back into old patterns. They see that you're still here, still pushing, still growing, still evolving. And that creates a shift. Because now, it's not about whether you'll break, it's about how far you'll go. And that question makes people uncomfortable. Because it forces them to reconsider everything they assumed about you. It forces them to acknowledge that maybe they underestimated you. And more importantly, it forces them to look at themselves. Because your persistence highlights what's possible. It shows that the breaking point isn't always where people think it is. It shows that limits can be extended. It shows that the moment when everything feels like it's falling apart can actually be the moment where something stronger is being built. That's a difficult truth to accept, because it removes excuses. It removes the safety of saying, "That's just how things are. You proved that things can be different, not by talking about it, but by living it. And the most powerful part, you didn't become unbreakable because life got easier. You became stronger because you changed the way you responded to it. You stopped seeing challenges as signals to stop. You started seeing them as tests to pass. You stopped interpreting discomfort as danger. You started recognizing it as growth. That shift, subtle as it is what separates those who break from those who evolve. And now, even when things get hard again, because they will, you carry something you didn't have before. Evidence. Proof that you've been here before. Proof that you've felt this pressure, this doubt, this uncertainty, and made it through. That changes how you approach everything. You don't panic the same way. You don't retreat as quickly. You don't question your ability as deeply. Because you know, from experience, that you can handle more than you once believed. And that knowledge, it builds confidence. Not the loud, temporary kind, but the quiet, steady kind. The kind that doesn't need validation. The kind that doesn't disappear under pressure. The kind that grows stronger every time you refuse to break. So now, when people look at you, they don't just see someone who made it through a tough time. They see someone who didn't follow the expected outcome. Someone who didn't collapse when it would have been easy to. Someone who faced the same pressures, but made a different choice. And that's what makes the difference. Not that life tested you, but that when it did, you didn't give it the ending it expected. Your mind is the battlefield, not out there. Not in the noise, not in the opinions, not in the chaos of the world around you. All of that is just background. The real conflict, the one that decides everything, happens inside you, quietly, constantly, whether you notice it or not. Every thought is a move. Every reaction is a decision. Every belief is a position you either defend or replace. And most people don't even realize they're in a fight. They think life is happening to them, when in reality, their mind is interpreting, shaping, and sometimes distorting everything they experience. That's where the real struggle begins. Not with what happens, but with what you tell yourself about what happens. Because the moment something goes wrong, the battlefield lights up. A voice says, "You're not good enough." Another whispers, "You always mess this up." A louder one pushes, "Just stop. It's easier." And if you're not paying attention, those voices don't sound like thoughts, they sound like truth. That's how the mind traps you, not by force, but by repetition. The same negative patterns playing over and over until they feel familiar. And once something feels familiar, it starts to feel safe. Even if it's limiting you, even if it's holding you back, even if it's quietly destroying your confidence. That's the battlefield most people lose on. Not because they're weak, but because they don't question what's happening inside their own head. But you started noticing. At first, it was subtle. A small awareness that maybe every thought doesn't deserve your trust. Maybe not every emotion deserves your obedience. Maybe the voice in your head isn't always on your side. That realization alone changes everything. Because now, instead of being controlled by your mind, you begin to observe it. You start catching the patterns. You notice how quickly your thoughts jump to worst-case scenarios. You see how one small mistake turns into a full story about failure. You recognize how your mood shifts based on what you focus on. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. That's when the fight becomes real. Because now you have a choice. You can follow those thoughts. Let them guide your actions, shape your behavior, define your identity. Or you can challenge them. Not by pretending they don't exist, but by questioning their authority. Is this actually true? Is this helping me? Do I have evidence for this, or is this just fear talking? Those questions are weapons. Simple, but powerful. Because they interrupt the automatic patterns that used to run your life without resistance. And when you interrupt a pattern, you create space. Space to think differently. Space to respond instead of react. Space to choose a direction that aligns with who you want to become. Not who your fear is trying to convince you that you are. But make no mistake, this isn't easy. Because your mind doesn't give up control quietly. It pushes back. It gets louder. It throws more doubt at you. It tries to pull you back into familiar territory, the place where you second-guess yourself, where you hesitate, where you play small. That's the resistance. And that's how you know you're in the fight. Because growth doesn't happen when everything is calm. It happens when you're in the middle of that internal conflict, choosing discipline over comfort, clarity over confusion, action over avoidance. You start building something new. Mental strength, not the kind that ignores emotion, but the kind that understands it. You don't try to eliminate fear. You learn how to move with it. You don't try to silence doubt completely. You reduce its influence. You don't wait for confidence. You act in its absence and let it grow through experience. That's how control is built. One decision at a time. Every time you choose to focus instead of spiral, you win a small battle. Every time you act despite hesitation, you gain ground. Every time you replace a limiting thought with a constructive one, you shift the balance. And over time, those small wins compound. The battlefield doesn't disappear, but it changes. It becomes less chaotic, less overwhelming, less reactive, because now you're not just a participant in your mind. You're leading it. That's where things start to feel different. You don't get pulled into every negative thought. You don't react to every emotional spike. You don't let every external situation dictate your internal state. You begin to operate with intention. You choose what deserves your attention. You decide what deserves your energy. You determine how you respond, regardless of what's happening around you. That's power. Not control over the world, but control over your interpretation of it. And that changes everything. Because the same situation that used to break your focus now becomes manageable. The same challenge that used to trigger self-doubt now becomes something you analyze and handle. The same pressure that used to overwhelm you now becomes something you prepare for and move through. It's not that life gets easier. It's that you become stronger where it matters most, inside. And once you build that strength, something shifts permanently. You stop fearing your own mind. You stop avoiding difficult thoughts. You stop running from uncomfortable emotions because you know you can handle them. You've proven it to yourself. You've faced the noise, the doubt, the fear. And instead of being consumed by it, you learned how to navigate it. That's not something anyone can take from you. That's earned. And the more you practice it, the more stable you become. Not unshakable, but resilient. Grounded, focused. You still feel everything, but you're no longer controlled by everything. That's the difference. That's what separates someone who reacts from someone who leads themselves. And once you reach that point, the battlefield doesn't intimidate you the same way anymore. It becomes familiar, not comfortable, but understood. You know what to expect. You know how to respond. You know that no matter how intense it gets, you have the tools to move through it. And that knowledge, it builds a quiet confidence. The kind that doesn't need to prove anything. The kind that doesn't panic under pressure. The kind that stays steady, even when everything around it is uncertain. Because at the end of the day, this isn't about eliminating struggle. It's about mastering your response to it. And when your mind becomes a place of awareness instead of chaos, when your thoughts become tools instead of obstacles, when your reactions become choices instead of habits, that's when the battlefield stops controlling you, and you start controlling the outcome. Silence the noise. Not because the world suddenly gets quiet, but because you decide what deserves to be heard. The noise never really stops. It's everywhere. In opinions, in expectations, in comparisons, in the constant stream of voices telling you who you should be, how fast you should move, what success should look like, what failure means. Some of it comes from people around you. Some of it comes from what you see online. And the most dangerous part, a lot of it comes from inside your own head. At first, it all blends together. You hear doubt and assume it's truth. You hear criticism and assume it's reality. You hear fear and assume it's a warning you must obey. And before you realize it, you're no longer making decisions based on what you want. You're reacting to what you hear. That's how the noise takes control. It doesn't need to be loud. It just needs to be constant. A repeated thought becomes a belief. A repeated belief becomes a habit. A repeated habit becomes your identity. And suddenly, you're living a version of your life that was shaped more by external voices than your own internal clarity. That's where most people stay. Not because they can't think for themselves, but because they never learned how to filter what enters their mind. But you started noticing something. You realized that not every voice deserves your attention. Not every opinion deserves your reaction. Not every thought deserves your belief. That awareness is where the shift begins. Because once you recognize the noise for what it is, distraction, projection, fear, conditioning, you can begin to separate it from what actually matters. But silencing the noise doesn't mean shutting everything out. It means choosing. Choosing what you listen to. Choosing what you absorb. Choosing what you let influence your direction. And that requires discipline. Because the noise is persistent. It shows up when you're about to take a risk. It shows up when you're trying something new. It shows up when you're already unsure of yourself. It says things like, "What if this doesn't work? What will people think? You're not ready yet. You should wait. Stay where it's safe." And if you're not careful, those thoughts start to sound reasonable. That's how hesitation is created. Not from a lack of ability, but from an overload of conflicting voices. But here's the truth most people don't realize: clarity doesn't come from more input. It comes from less. The more noise you allow, the harder it becomes to hear yourself and your own voice. That's the one that matters most. The one that knows what you want. The one that understands your direction. The one that doesn't need validation to move forward. But it's quiet. It doesn't shout like fear. It doesn't repeat itself like doubt. It doesn't demand attention like external opinions. It waits. And if your mind is too crowded, you miss it. That's why silence is powerful. Not physical silence, mental silence. The ability to pause before reacting. The ability to step back before believing every thought. The ability to create space between what you hear and what you accept. That space changes everything. Because in that space, you gain control. You stop reacting automatically. You stop absorbing everything without question. You start filtering. And once you start filtering, something interesting happens. The noise loses its power. It's still there, but it doesn't affect you the same way. Criticism doesn't shake you as deeply. Doubt doesn't linger as long. Fear doesn't stop you as quickly. Because now, you're not giving everything equal weight. You're evaluating. You're asking, is this useful? Is this relevant? Does this align with where I'm going? If the answer is no, you let it go. Not emotionally, not aggressively, just intentionally. That's what it means to silence the noise. It's not about fighting every thought or proving every opinion wrong. It's about not engaging with what doesn't serve you. That's a different kind of strength, because it requires restraint. It requires confidence in your direction, even when others don't understand it. It requires trust in your process, even when results aren't immediate. It requires the ability to stay focused, even when distractions are constant. And that's not easy, because the world rewards reaction. It pulls you into conversations, comparisons, debates, expectations. It makes you feel like you need to respond, explain, justify. But you don't. Not everything deserves your energy. And once you accept that, your focus sharpens. You start moving differently. You spend less time thinking about what others are doing. You spend less time questioning every step. You spend more time building, improving, progressing. That's where real momentum comes from. Not from doing more, but from eliminating what doesn't matter. Because every moment you spend listening to noise is a moment you're not investing in yourself. And those moments add up, so you become more intentional. You protect your attention. You protect your energy. You protect your mindset. Not out of fear, but out of understanding. Understanding that your mind is limited in what it can process effectively. Understanding that focus is a resource. Understanding that where you direct your attention determines your outcome. That awareness changes your habits. You become more selective about what you consume, more mindful of who you listen to, more aware of how certain environments affect your thinking. And slowly, your internal world becomes clearer, less cluttered, less reactive, more focused. That's when your decisions improve, because now they're coming from clarity, not confusion. They're based on what matters to you, not what's being projected onto you. They're aligned with your direction, not influenced by temporary noise. And that alignment, it builds confidence, not because everything is certain, but because you trust your ability to navigate uncertainty. You trust your ability to stay grounded, even when things get loud around you. You trust your ability to keep moving forward, even when distractions try to pull you off course. That's what makes the difference. Not the absence of noise, but your response to it, because the noise will always be there. Opinions won't stop. Doubt won't disappear completely. Fear will still show up from time to time, but none of it controls you anymore, because you've learned how to listen selectively. You've learned how to think independently. You've learned how to move intentionally. And once you reach that point, something shifts permanently. You stop looking for approval. You stop reacting to everything. You stop letting outside voices define your inside world. Instead, you operate from a place of clarity, a place where your focus is sharp, your direction is steady, and your energy is invested where it actually matters. That's what happens when you silence the noise. You don't just think better. You become harder to distract, harder to influence, and impossible to control. And that's where real progress begins. Rewrite your story. Not the version that people remember. Not the version that was told about you, labeled you, limited you, or reduced you to a moment in time.
That version.
It's incomplete. It's shaped by perspectives that didn't see the full picture. It's built on chapters that were never meant to be the ending. And for a long time, maybe you believed it. Maybe you carried it with you. The mistakes, the failures, the labels, the moments that didn't go your way, the times you felt like you weren't enough, or you were too much, or you were simply stuck. Those experiences started to feel like definitions instead of phases. That's how a story traps you. Not because it's true in its entirety, but because it's repeated enough times that it feels final. This is just who I am. This is how things go for me. This is what my life looks like. And without realizing it, you stop questioning it. You stop imagining anything beyond it. You stop rewriting. But here's the truth: most people overlook a story only has power if you keep telling it the same way. And at some point, you paused. Maybe it was subtle. Maybe it came after something hit you harder than usual. Maybe it was a quiet realization that you were tired of being the same version of yourself, tired of repeating the same patterns, tired of living inside a narrative that didn't match who you wanted to become. That moment matters, because that's where awareness begins. You start to see that your past isn't a prison. It's a reference. You start to see that your mistakes aren't identities. They're lessons. You start to see that your story isn't finished. It's still being written. And once you see that, something shifts. You realize that you're not stuck with the version of yourself that was shaped by circumstances you couldn't control. You have a say now, not over what happened, but over what it means. That's where rewriting begins, not by denying the past, but by redefining it. The failure that once felt like proof that you weren't capable becomes evidence that you tried, that you learned, that you now know what doesn't work. The rejection that once felt like a reflection of your worth becomes clarity about what doesn't align with you. The struggle that once felt like a dead end becomes the foundation of your resilience. Same events, different interpretation, different direction. That's power. Because when you change the meaning, you change the outcome. But rewriting your story isn't just about how you look at the past. It's about how you act in the present. Because every decision you make right now is a sentence in the next chapter. And for a while, those decisions might feel unfamiliar. You might choose discipline over comfort, growth over ease, action over hesitation, and it won't feel natural at first, because you're breaking patterns. patterns that were reinforced over time, patterns that once felt automatic, patterns that kept your story predictable. But predictability is exactly what you're leaving behind. Because the moment you decide to rewrite your story, you accept uncertainty. You accept that you don't fully know how everything will unfold. You accept that the new version of yourself isn't fully formed yet, and that can feel uncomfortable. Because the old story, even if it wasn't ideal, was familiar. It gave you a sense of identity, a role, a script. Now, you're stepping into something undefined, and that requires courage. Because you're no longer reacting to what happened. You're creating what happens next. That's a different mindset. Instead of asking, "Why did this happen to me?" you start asking, "What do I do with this now?" Instead of saying, "This is who I am," you start asking, "Who do I want to become?" Instead of waiting for change, you start initiating it. That shift from passive to active is what transforms everything. Because now your story isn't something you're trapped in, it's something you're shaping. But make no mistake, rewriting isn't instant. It's not a single decision that changes everything overnight. It's a series of consistent choices, small ones, daily ones, choices that align with the version of yourself you're building, even when it's inconvenient, even when it's uncomfortable, even when no one is watching. That's where the real work happens. Because it's easy to say you want a new story. It's harder to live like it's already being written, to show up differently, to think differently, to respond differently, especially when the old patterns try to pull you back. And they will. The old thoughts will resurface. The old doubts will reappear. The old version of you will try to remind you of who you used to be. But now you see it. You recognize it as the past trying to stay relevant. And instead of falling back into it, you move forward anyway. That's rewriting, not perfection. Progress. And over time, something starts to change. The new actions become habits. The new mindset becomes natural. The new identity becomes real. You start to see yourself differently, not as someone defined by what they went through, but as someone shaped by how they responded to it. That's a powerful shift. Because now, your confidence isn't based on external validation. It's based on evidence. Evidence that you can change. Evidence that you can grow. Evidence that you can create a different outcome. And that confidence, it builds quietly. It doesn't need to be loud. It shows up in your decisions, in your consistency, in your ability to stay focused even when things aren't perfect. That's when your story starts to look different, not just to you, but to others. People who once saw you a certain way start to notice the change. Patterns that once defined your life start to fade. Opportunities that once felt out of reach start to become possible. Not because everything around you changed, but because you did. And that's the part most people miss. Rewriting your story isn't about waiting for a different life. It's about becoming a different version of yourself within the same life. The one who thinks differently, acts differently, chooses differently. That's how new chapters are created. And once you're in that process, something becomes clear. Your past didn't disqualify you. It prepared you. Every challenge, every mistake, every setback, it all contributed something. It gave you perspective, awareness, strength, insight, things you wouldn't have developed otherwise. And now you're using them. Not as excuses, but as tools. That's the difference between staying stuck in a story and rewriting it. One keeps you looking back. The other moves you forward. So now, when you think about your life, it's no longer a fixed narrative. It's open, evolving, unfinished. And that's where your power is. Not in what's already been written, but in what you decide to write next.